right, so today in this application, what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to use SwiftUI to retrieve data from a remote database in the form of JSON and parse that JSON and turn it into data that can be displayed in a list view. So let's have a look. This is our final product here. You're going to see all of this stuff came from a MySQL database where we used a PHP script to retrieve that data from the MySQL database. And now we're sending it off to this iPhone app and displayed in SwiftUI using a list view. In our first video, so this is part 2 of a 2-part video. In the first video, we already talked about how to create a SQLite database and a table, and how to create the simple PHP script to retrieve that data. We were assuming we were using cPanel in a simple implementation to be able to create all of those things. So using PHP MyAdmin, and so on to upload and to upload our scripts and to create our database table there. Now, and I have this web browser open. This is the URL I'm using here, and essentially, you're seeing that this is the data that we're going to pull and display here. All right, so it's in JSON encoded objects. All right, so let's begin. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new project. So you're going to say iOS single view application, and we're going to call this we'll call it M6 remote JSON parsing. All right, and we'll call it we'll use the user interface as SwiftUI and leave everything else unchecked. Hit next, give it a home. All right, so now that we have our project created, let's go ahead and set up this project. So we'll start with content view. We'll just make a very simple homepage. So what we'll do is we'll put this inside a navigation view. All right, and put the closing curly outside of it. All right, and within navigation view, we will have a VStack. All right, and have a closing curly outside of the text. All right, and let's say welcome for text. We'll say welcome to our remote database parsing app. Let's give it some padding of 10. All right, and let's add a navigation link to a new page. But before we do that, let's add a second page. So I'm going to right click on my folder there in the project view. I'm going to say add new file, iOS SwiftUI view, and let's call it list data view. All right, and now what we'll do is I'll just drag this to be right next to content view. I'm going to jump back to content view. Actually, before I do, let's inside list data view, let's give this, let's call it hello list data world. All right, just some text to differentiate where we're navigating to. Okay, just Command S to save that. I'll switch back to content view.swift. And let's add a navigation link below the text. So we'll say navigation link. All right, we'll say destination will be list data view instantiated. Close that round bracket, open up set of codes. I'm going to do very simple text to say begin. So we'll say text begin. So very simple button. Dot padding of 10. All right, and that's good enough. Let's give it a run. Verify we have everything there. So we'll use this simulator. There we go. So welcome to our remote database parsing app. Hit begin. Hello, this data world. So we've got our basic shell up and running. All right. So now the next step is to create the code that will remotely grab the data from our PHP script and ultimately from our MySQL database. So we're going to add a new file to our project. All right. So I'm just going to actually hit stop. I'm going to right click and say new file. Now this time it'll be iOS Cocoa Touch class. All right. And this time we'll call it get data. Make it a subclass of NS object. All right. And we'll give it a home. So we're just creating a simple object here. And we're going to use a class instead of a struct. We'll be using a struct still, but we're going to need an NS object this time around. So we'll hit next, give it a home. All right. I'm going to modify and change because by default it wants to bring in UI kit. I'm going to say import SwiftUI. All right, let's switch that over. And we're still going to use a little bit of SwiftUI here. Okay, we have class get data extends NS object. We're going to change that. First things first, I want to create a structure that will manage all of the data coming in. Now, actually, if I bring back the look of the structure of our data. And just pick apart one of the lines. We have here like name with capital N. We have address with a capital A. I also overstepped ID. ID is all caps. All right. Email. All right. And finally, salary. Okay. So we want to match up our variable names to be data types, and they're all strings. We'll keep it as strings. You can always convert to ints later if you need to. We want to match up the names. So capital for first letter, and the rest are all lowercase. Okay, so we want to match this up. So first thing we'll do is we'll create a structure to house this data. So I'm going to say public struct, call it people, extends codable, and also hashable. All right, this is needed for when we are, because this struct is very special. It's going to have the ability to pull the JSON data. It's going to work in tandem with an object called NSJSON parser to parse the data and pull it directly into instances of these objects, which will be in an array of objects, depending on how many lines of data we have. And it's special when we make it codable and hashable because what we're doing here is we are enabling it to directly, based on the variable names we're about to add, copy the data directly into the correct variable. All right. So you'll see that the variables I'm going to create right now will match the column names of the data we're grabbing. So I'm going to say public var ID is all caps, like I said a moment ago. It'll be a string. We'll say public var name with a capital N, string as well. Public var email, string. Public var address, string. And finally, public var salary, string. All right. And we're going to need a special method we're not going to use it, but just to satisfy the constraints of hashable. It's going to complain soon, so we'll get it out of the way. It's public func hash. See if it'll autocomplete. Probably not. So we'll just type it in into hasher, in out hasher. We are just continuing on the interface that was already created. We'll just say hasher.combine for name. All right, we're not using this method. It has no meaning. We're just adding this method to satisfy errors that are going to come up soon. Okay, so we're better off bringing it in now. If you mistype anything in this line here, you will still get the error that you're going to encounter eventually. So it's best to double check the spelling, the capitals, and so on. And we're just doing a hasher.combine for one of the variables. Okay. All right, so now let's get into creating our special class that will download the data. We're going to do it inside get data. All right, now we're going to modify this. It'll be actually public class get data extends observable object. Sorry, observable object. An observable object is an object that is special. It allows it to be essentially shared amongst classes, and in particular, it is used to keep. It's also used to keep track of the state. So any modifications to the variables, the data inside this object, will trigger a repaint in any view that utilizes the data here. All right, and so we're going to be using this observable object in our list data view, so that anytime we change the data, it'll refresh our list view automatically. Okay, because what we're about to do is we're about to write code that will run asynchronously. It'll go to the database, download the data, grab it, bring it back. We don't know how long that's going to take. It could be a good connection and happen fast. It could be a horrible connection and happen really slow. We need our our list, thinking Swift here, our list to refresh when ready, when the data appears. In a previous implementation of this type of project, I had to use NS timer and check like every half second for the data in that I'm retrieving to be in an array greater than, well, with a length greater than 0, right? Once I knew that the length was greater than 0, I had to trigger a refresh of a table view. All right, I don't have to do that anymore because I'm using observable object and its sister observed object, which we will see in a moment. All right, so let's see what I'm talking about here. So we're going to say public class get data extends observable object. We need a variable to hold our data. All right, so we're going to say at published var, call it people with lowercase p, which is equal to, we're going to instantiate an empty people array with capital P. All right, an empty array. And so now we have our data ready to go. Now let's add a constructor to this class so that when it's instantiated, it automatically goes, runs, and grabs the data. So constructors, as you know, init. So init is the special word for it. So we're going to say init, no parameters. It already gave us our curlies, which is great. Now let's get into building out a method that will go and retrieve the data. So let's define our URL. We'll say let URL equal URL of string, and you're more than welcome to use this URL if you feel. All right, so got our URL here. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to initiate a connection to go and download the data at this URL. Now we need this to happen asynchronously. We don't want to block the whole phone waiting to download the data, so we're going to do this behind the scenes using a method called datatask. All right, and its purpose is to go and do what needs to be done asynchronously. It belongs in an object called URLSession. So it's actually URLSession.shared, which tells you it's a shared object. It's been instantiated already, kind of like user defaults we talked about in the past, as well as app delegates and other objects as well. But URLSession.shared.datatask, all right, with the URL, which is just URL, all lowercase. All right. Now we need a completion handler. So I'm going to open up a set of curlies. All right. And we'll have to, I guess, type in our arguments ourselves. So there's like a bunch of fixits there. I want to make sure I get it right. So I'm going to type it myself. It's basically just, actually, I'll do it on a new line so you can see it better. It'll be data response error. Those are the 3 arguments that we are getting in. Remember, the keyword in is like saying begin. All right, so go ahead and begin what you're doing here. All right, it wants URL to be an option. It wants some sort of optional guarantee. I'm going to jump back to the URL definition. I'm going to put an exclamation mark saying, yeah, it's there. I promise that this URL, it's a string. It exists. It's not unwrapping the value, so to speak, to see if this actual PHP file exists, for example, or if the server exists. What it's doing is it's just saying, hey, I've got a string and I'm passing it in. It's a URL. It's an object that exists. So keep in mind, understand the difference there. All right. Now, there's a lot that can go wrong in this type of operation. So we need to have, and you know from other languages, try catches. While we have in Swift do catch. So we're gonna define a do catch here, and we'll put everything inside. We'll put everything inside the do catch here. I'm just gonna say I'm gonna finish the catch first because it's easier that way. All right, and we'll just do a simple print to the console to help us with debugging. Of course, you might want to put an alert instead if you have some serious issues there. We'll say error and just pass in whatever the error is. All right, so it'll print it out. Okay, now don't worry about the warning there. Of course, there's no it's unreachable because yeah, we haven't started anything yet. But let's go ahead and let's make it happen. Let's grab the data from the database. So we'll put stuff inside an if let. So we'll say if let people data equals data. So we're using an if let here to verify that, hey, we're actually getting some data. That data is not nil. All right, if data is not nil, there's no point in going ahead and attempting this operation. But the operation we're going to apply to do here is to convert the data we've just received into JSON objects. Now, keep in mind here, now that I've executed this code, what happens is it's going to the URL, right? It's going to retrieve the data from the database. It's going to bring it back in the form of a variable called data. All right. So at this point, if I'm here, it means that the data is ready to be processed. All right. So that's how you're doing an if let here to say, okay, I've got my data. It's ready to go. Let's start parsing it as JSON objects. Okay. Now we're saying if let people data equals data. So let's go ahead and convert it from JSON into an array of people objects here. So we're going to use an object called JSON decoder. You'll instantiate it and say .decode. Now the type of data will be an array of people objects with capital P .self. All right, from people data. That's it. It's converted. Assuming everything's good, you basically have all of your data. Now it's gonna take a bit of time. All right. So what we're gonna do is we're going to put this inside a dispatch main.async, but we'll do that in a second because we got to solve this error. Now I should tell you what we need to do is this returns data back. So we need to have a variable that'll catch and save this data. So we're going to say let decoded data equal, and there was another error that's going to pop up saying this is a method. This is a method call that can throw a lot of errors. So we need to put this inside a try statement. All right. So this is actually the line of code we're actually doing here. So we're saying we're creating a variable called decoded data. It'll be the result of doing my JSON decoder.decode. We're going to save we'll have an array of people objects. This is the structure of the data that's going to be managed here. Okay. So at this point, we have decoded data. It's been converted from JSON objects. It's actually ready to go here. Now it's actually in the form of JSON, right? It's been converted from data, which is of type NS data here. Okay. Now it's ready to be converted. So we can actually print this out. So because it's an asynchronous operation in itself, we need to wait till it's done. So we'll say dispatch queue dot main dot async, and inside of it, let's print it to the console so we can verify we got data. So we'll say print, and we'll say decoded data. All right, it's in the form of data in an array, and let's save it to our published variable called people. So we'll say self.people is equal to decoded data. All right. So now, assuming that everything's been processed And in the meantime, we're going to actually wait until this has been processed. Once it's been processed, it jumps here. Now that people has been updated, people is a published variable. Any view that is in our case, which will, in a moment will be a list, will basically refresh and repaint. Okay. And there's one last thing we have to do. Well, a couple of things we have to do. We had an if let here. Let's complete our if let by having an else and just saying like print, like no data, just to debug, just for debug purposes. But finally, this call of URLSession.shared.datatask needs one additional line. All right. We have here our catch just outside of the catch in the closing curly that matches up with this opening curly. We need to also say dot resume. The purpose of this dot resume call is that when it calls this data task call, it will block for a moment and it might get stuck. All right. You might be wondering, okay, I made the call. What's going on? Why isn't it happening? Well, this dot resume call sort of forces it to continue processing, continue on what it needs to do. All right. So that's it. This is our get data. Now it's up to us to apply this people data that we have here in our list. Okay. So it's going to save it. All right. Let's do a Command B. Verify no errors. Build succeeded. So far, so good. Now we're going to switch over to list data view.swift and actually build out a list to work with. All right. So now what we'll do is we're going to modify our list data view to incorporate a actual list, a custom list. I'm going to drop the whole preview struct so we don't get any errors. Let's start by creating our struct for our custom row. Now we've talked about lists in the past, so you can refer to a past video in how to create a list, especially with a custom set of rows. So we'll start by creating our custom row. We'll say struct person row extends a view with a capital V. And we'll have a variable var person lowercase p extends people with a capital P and no array, just one object to work with. All right. Now it's complaining. Let's make it happy. We need to have a body here, so we'll say var body extends some view. All right. And now let's start by defining our rows of text. We'll just have 4 simple rows of text. We'll put it inside a VStack. First text will be name : and then /person.name. All right. We'll say that dot font is dot headline. All right. We'll say dot foreground color is dot black. We'll say that dot multi-line text alignment is dot leading. We want to have it left justified. And we'll also add a frame. So we'll say dot frame will be width will be 300, height will be 30, alignment will be dot leading as well. All right, that'll be person dot name. Actually, name is a capital N. My apologies there, because we use capitals there. Now I don't want to type this 4 more times, so let's just Command C to copy, Command V to paste. The second one will be person dot address. All right, but the rest of these will be subheadlines. So subheadline, and we'll change the color. So foreground color for the second line will be blue. All right. Okay. Now third one will be person dot email. All right. Also subheadline. And this color will make green. All right. And one more. This will be person.salary. All right. Also subheadline. All right, and this last color, we'll make it red. All right, and that's it for our row. All right, and like we talked about in the past, creating lists 1,000 times easier in SwiftUI than it was in UIKit. So now we have our custom row. Now let's actually apply this in an actual list. So we're going to scroll down to our list data view, and let's apply this. Now, first things first, we created an observable object called getData a moment ago. All right. So now let's call upon it. Okay. So we're going to say at observed object. So we said observable object in getData. Now we're saying at observed object. So be careful of the naming terminology here. So we want to retrieve data. Inside our view, we're using observed object. The data itself exists in an observable object. Be careful of the terminology there. It's very close. I'll say observed object var, I'll call it fetch, equals, we're going to instantiate get data. So it'll go ahead and instantiate it, make the request because it has a init, everything's there ready to go. And let's go ahead and replace this text with a list. All right, and inside the list, we'll do a for each fetch dot people, comma ID colon slash dot self. And then inside of the completion handler for the for each, we'll say p in, and actually I'll put that p in on the same line. All right, and inside of here, we'll say person row passing in p. And that's it. All right, so now let's give it a run. All right, we'll hit begin. Now there is, now let's look at the console first of all here. It didn't work. It didn't work because my URL is an HTTP URL, and this error came out called transport security policy requires the use of a secure connection. So by default, I'm supposed to be using HTTPS URLs. I'm not in this example, so it's going to block it. All right, and therefore you see this result, no data, and you can test it out, see for yourself, hit begin, there's nothing here. Well, we're gonna break a rule here because I'm using an insecure URL, but it's my URL, it's my server, so it's okay. What we're gonna do is to break this rule and actually allow us to have insecure connections. I don't recommend it, but just for knowledge sake and just for learning purposes, we're gonna do it here, is to go to info.plist. All right, and info.plist, this is also another set of settings. This is like a more lower level set of settings. And it's especially useful for areas where we don't have settings that exist here, right? We don't have areas that exist here. So we need to add some custom settings here. So I'm going to add a custom setting by hitting information property list, hitting the plus sign. And the security setting I'm looking for is app space transport with a capital T, and you can see here now it's auto completing. So app transport, make sure you use capitals where needed, so capital A and capital T at least. App transport security settings, gonna hit enter. All right, now I need a subsetting for this particular setting. In order to have a subsetting, I have to hit the triangle here, make a point down. All right, then I can add the subsetting by hitting the plus sign here. And I'm just gonna go with allow arbitrary loads because I'm feeling lazy. There's a lot more settings there. Just hit enter and change that no to a yes. All right, and give it a run. Then you can see here's my data. We did the print statement on purpose because I wanted to see my data. All right, so I know that the process worked. It grabbed my data. Let's see if the list, and it did. The list worked. All right, so everything is here. All right, that's it. It's really simple to grab data from a database remotely and bring it in and display it in an iPhone app. Okay, so that's what we covered for today. We learned how to grab data from a remote URL. We convert it from JSON into data, and then we applied that data to a list view. All right, that's it for today. Until the next app, take care. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and feel free to comment. Until then, take care, and see you in the next tutorial.